Hey everyone. So here we are in our next week of contemporary literature, and we're going to look at two African American writers. And I also want to introduce to you some concepts in literary criticism. So, in this module, we have Alice Walker, who is a fiction writer, and Nikki Giovanni, who is a poet. So, Alice Walker is an African American author known most for her novel The Color Purple, which was made into a feature length film. Her story, Everyday Use, that we're reading in this module, is from 1973, and it's told from the perspective of the mother of two young women, Dee and Maggie. So both Dee and Maggie have different ways of coping with their past. Their personal past that involved a devastating fire. Maggie still has scars from that fire. And also their family's past. Their family comes from poor sharecroppers in the Deep South. Maggie, who has scars on her body from that fire, is withdrawn, quiet, and reluctant. Dee, who has gone away to college and decided to change her name to Wangero. She is outgoing and ambitious. Dee is collecting old items from her mother's house to use as decoration in her new home, and she wants to take a quilt made from scraps of their ancestors' clothing, even a piece of fabric from a great grandfather's Union Army coat is part of this quilt. So, as you know, a quilt is traditionally made from various small pieces of fabric that are then sewn together and sometimes stuffed with other scraps of fabric to make a thick, like, comforter. Before there were comforters, everyone made their own quilts. And so, this quilt is a very meaningful symbol for all of the characters, but I think for different reasons. As you read the story, think about how Dee views that quilt and how Maggie, along with the mother of the girls, who is the narrator, how they may see it differently. Both Dee and Maggie demonstrate ways to view their family's past. That includes the poverty that is the legacy of slavery. Dee has moved away from that identity, away from being a poor person from the South, at the cost, I think, of a certain amount of authenticity. Maggie has maintained some of those old traditions. Maggie is living at home with her mother. Maggie also knows how to quilt. But she, deciding to live at home while Dee goes out and gets an education. So, in the end, notice who gets to keep the quilt and think about why that might be. Make sure you explain that in your discussion board post. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about literary criticism, which is what we are also practicing in this course. Every time we analyze a literary text, every time we read it closely, ask questions about how it makes meaning and how it's meaningful to us, we engage in criticism. And so at this point in your studies, you should be familiar with some ways to analyze a story. You can look at what drives a character, why they do what they do. You can look at the patterns of the plot. You can look at where climactic moments happen, or if there's more than one climactic moment in the story where there is heightened tension, and why that might be. So, I want to begin in this course to familiarize you with different ways to analyze a literary text. So, in other words, we're learning about literary criticism. So, last week we read two dystopias. Now, that is a genre of fiction. a genre that depicts a society that is organized in such a way so as to create a great injustice, to violate some basic human rights. So, in our discussion, we explored what characterizes that genre. Defining a genre, or a genre, in other words, is a type or category of literature. Defining a genre is an important role of the literary critic. So this week, we are looking at the short story Everyday Use by Alice Walker. I would like to point out three ways that we can analyze this text. The first way is that we can enact a feminist critique. We can look at how femininity is represented in the story. We can look at what makes each female character seem feminine or not feminine. We can look at the domestic duties each woman performs and the expectations that are placed on the characters because they are women. We can also consider that this is a story written by a woman and with a female narrator. The character of the narrator here is important. How is it significant that it is she telling the story? How can this story represent a worldview that is particular to that woman in that time and place? So, a feminist critique is very focused and attentive to gender and the expectations that characters or that readers would have about that gender. And then let's move to the second type of literary criticism. The second way we can analyze a text is by looking at the economic realities represented in the story and how these economic realities affect the ideas the characters have about the world and about their place in it. This is what I consider a Marxist critique, or some would call it a materialist critique, looking closely at the economic realities and how those economic realities affect the ideas characters have about themselves and the world. Marxist refers to the writer Karl Marx, who was a political theorist from Germany who wrote during the 19th century. He was very critical of the growth of industrial capitalism, of the growth of factories and industrialization. And he was critical also of the way that it changed our social relations. And that form of criticism, Marxist criticism, examines the material reality of the characters. What do their lives look like? What kind of stuff do they have? What are their living conditions? In other words, the economic relationships the characters are in. This also includes socioeconomic class and what makes classes different from each other. So, a poor person who is a laborer, like the narrator in the story, she has lived on a farm her whole life and done all the work herself. A laborer would have a view of the world that is different from someone who is of a higher class, who maybe works in a very professional setting and who lives in much more comfortable surroundings. A Marxist critique of the story Everyday Use would consider how Dee and Maggie represent different social classes. Dee went away to college, she's educated, and as people say today, she's a little bougie. She's overdressed, her hair is done, she has big earrings on and this very beautiful flowing dress. While Maggie and the narrator are not that fancy. So, because of these different social classes, they see the purpose of this quilt differently. Dee wants to hang it up on the wall, use it for decoration. She sees it more as like an artifact. While Maggie, Dee says, would be so stupid as to keep this quilt for everyday use. And that would mean she would eventually, from using it, wear it out, diminishing its value as an artifact to hang on the wall. So there's value in this quilt that goes beyond monetary value. It is a way to reconnect to the past. Dee and the narrator have different ideas about how to honor that past. So, in a Marxist critique, we would ascribe those differences to social class and economic realities. So, those are two very important ways to analyze fiction. We can look at gender in a feminist critique, or we can look at social class in a Marxist critique. Now, the last one I want to mention is not one I necessarily want you to practice, but I want you to be aware of it. And lastly, there's another mode that we can analyze this story with, and that is a structuralist way. Structuralism refers to a mode of criticism that was popular in academic circles at the time these stories were published in the 60s and 70s. And structuralism, that's the 1960s and 1970s, by the way. Structuralism looks at the abstract structure or pattern of the story. And in particular, structuralism looks at the conflicts or the contrasts that the story creates. So, a structuralist approach would analyze how the story sets up two daughters in conflict as different ways to relate to what the quilt represents. And the quilt is symbolic, right? Then there's the narrator. In this pattern, the narrator is like the judge who has to choose, right, between these two options. And that choice means who is more deserving of this quilt. And therefore, who would correctly honor the past that the quilt represents. A structuralist critic would always be looking for an underlying pattern, often a conflict between two forces that underlies the plot and or the characterization. So, as we move forward in the semester, I will be guiding you in using these techniques through the discussion board and the essay questions. So for now, just remember that the feminist critique looks at what in the text defines gender and the expectations we have about that gender. Second, the Marxist critique looks at how economic realities affect the worldview of the character. And then the third, the structuralist technique. Structuralism looks at the underlying hidden pattern that contributes to the story's meaning. So, in our discussion post this week, I ask you to analyze the symbol of the quilt in the story. Dee, or Wangero, wants to take the quilt from her mother to use as decoration, while it's Maggie who knows how to quilt and can maintain the traditions of her household. So make sure you explain what the blanket symbolizes for both Dee and Maggie, and why the narrator and the mother chooses to give the quilt to the person she gives it to. Think of the character of the narrator and how she may view each daughter. Keep that in mind as you compose your response. Also, think about the kind of critique you are using. Try to be aware of what you're doing as you analyze this story. I will also try to point that out in my response. And then, our poem of the week. The next reading, I should say, in this module is a poem by Giovanni. The poem is called Dreams. And here she describes the dreams she had as a young girl and how that dream changed. First, her dreams are to be a young singer, and she quotes the song Night and Day from the Ray Charles group, or Ray Charles and the Rayettes. That's a blues group that was led by Ray Charles and includes the singer Margie Hendricks, who Nikki Giovanni mentions in the poem. So listen to the YouTube video I posted and look at the wiki for some information about this singer that Giovanni mentions in the poem. When you listen to the song Night and Day, notice the boldness of Hendrix's singing. This persona seems very different, I think, from the sweet inspiration that Giovanni mentions in the end. So, for this discussion board, I want you to tell me, do you think being the inspiration is more effective? I look forward to reading your thoughts.